Hello, you've found the Centrelink Stories podcast. This podcast is aimed at people who rely on Centrelink for assistance and those who work there who come and share their stories about what happens when you have to rely on Centrelink. Anybody can tell you there's hardly ever a dull moment. You either get a strange letter or somebody's doing something in the office. If we want to make the system better, we have to fight for it. So come listen, come tell your stories, and let's get into it.
Was never broken, it was built this way. Do we change things for the better, or just sit back and pray? I'm tired, so tired, and there's nothing left to say. Stand up with me, brother, or get the fuck out my way.
Hello and welcome to the Centrelink Stories podcast. Before we get into the stories, I'm Azrael Knox, and I need to go over some housekeeping. This section will be hard-coded into the beginning of every single episode, just for clarity and protect us legally. If you've already heard this part, please skip to 2 minutes 15 seconds. The Centrelink Stories podcast is not officially affiliated with Centrelink or any other Services Australia entity, nor is it affiliated with the Australian government. The Centrelink Stories podcast cannot directly help you with your Centrelink issue, but it is intended as a place for you to get your stories off your chest and move on to better things knowing someone has listened. The Centrelink Stories podcast is a place for people who rely on Centrelink, both recipients and employees, to share their stories if they choose to do so. We will never, ever in a million years ask to see your paperwork. We don't need it. You should never give it to anybody, even if they ask for it. The Centrelink Stories podcast will provide you a pseudonym on your behalf if you fail to provide one yourself. The Centrelink Stories podcast will take your stories to face value if you give us a false story that says more about you than us. However, we will issue a correction in the next episode lined up. The Centrelink Stories podcast is aware of subreddits and other social media groups. However, we will not be taking or asking for those stories. All stories that are told on the podcast must be submitted to us through our email and written in your own words. We will check and reject copy-pasters. All the boring stuff being said, let's get into the stories for this episode. Now that the housekeeping's out of the way, welcome to the first episode of Centrelink Stories. I apologise for the robot voice that's going to be coming through. These are archived stories from back when I tried to do this the first time. Let's just say that some people don't want these stories getting out there. I don't know why, but they went as far as to try to shut me down, sock up at me, dox me, you name it, they were trying to do it. The only reason I actually stopped at the time is because I had something else going on. Let's get into these archive stories. Again, I apologise for the robot voice, and any stories after this, you need to send to Centrelink customer stories at protonmail.com. That's the only ones I'll accept. This first archive story is about a straw man argument from Centrelink trying to punish somebody for moving.
This one really annoyed me because it's such a straw man argument and it gets tossed around a lot both by Centrelink and people that call anyone on Centrelink dole bludgeoners. Just before I get into the actual story, the definition of a straw man argument is an argument grounded in a fallacy to make their opponent's argument exaggerated or misleading so it's easier to undermine without actually acknowledging the argument itself or the facts behind it. Unfortunately, a perfect example of this is what happened with me and r/Centrelink, because I kept asking for their evidence and instead of answering me they just kept coming back to the same fallacious argument that I was doing something I wasn't. We've already heard enough about that, so let's move on. Let's get into this first story and I'll explain why it's a straw man afterward. The person who shared this story asked to remain anonymous. When I moved to a new area, I was told that it was an area of lower employment prospects and that because of that my payments could be suspended for up to 6 months. On the surface that sounds reasonable, does it not? I mean, yes, you will get some people that move out to rural areas to avoid work, but they are few and far between for numerous reasons. The main one being that moving is expensive. I moved across a small city not too long ago and if I didn't have my friends helping me, moving one bedroom of furniture would have cost me $400 to $600 just to get it across town. Then you need to add on the bond, let's say $1,000 to $1,200 for a cheap place. The first month's rent another $1,000 to $1,200. Utility connection fees $200 to $400. At a minimum that's $2,600 and for someone on job seeker that's usually about 2 to 3 months of payments without spending a cent over that time. Then there may be other associated fees or costs that are tacked on for someone's individual circumstances. Before someone comes out and says what about bond assistance? Bond assistance is tied up in the place you're currently living in if you've taken out an application for that and can't be released until you've secured a new place and gotten it returned to the government. What that often means is that people get stuck where they are, or they get stuck in limbo waiting for the bond to release on their current place before they can apply it to the new one, and sometimes that can take weeks or months and they end up missing out on the new place while being stuck in a rental they were supposed to leave some time ago. Funnily enough, realtors don't like that, and it causes a whole myriad of issues and stress. The next one in regards to expenses I hear quite often is, can't they just borrow the money from family or friends? The simple answer is maybe. A lot of the time their entire social group is in a similar place to them and aren't able to loan them anything at all without going into financial hardship themselves, because as stated above, the average job seeker payment is roughly $700 to $750 per fortnight with rent assistance. Now stop and ask yourself, if I'm living on $375 per week, am I going to be able to loan $500 to my brother Jimmy, whom is also living on $375 a week? The answer is probably no. But then you're going to get the people that say, well, surely they have a friend or a family who has a job and can help them out. And that's true, they might, but even if they have the means, which they may or may not, they're not obligated to, which is why we have the social safety net that is welfare. So, that's why this is a straw man argument on a financial basis. Even if someone on JobSeeker wanted to move to a rural area in an attempt to avoid work, they'd need a few $1,000s sitting in their back pocket. I know someone's going to say it, so I might as well get it out of the way. What if someone has a job and then quits to move to a rural area to avoid work? Well, then they're an idiot. I used to live in a rural area, and I can assure you that lack of transport even in the most remote of areas will not work as an excuse to miss your appointments with Centrelink or your job provider. I used to have to get on a train and wait 5 to 6 hours for the next train back for a 15-minute appointment. The next part of the straw man I want to cover is, well, if we don't put a deterrent on people moving to remote areas, all of the dole bludgers will just move to remote areas. It hasn't happened yet. Even if it did happen, that's not necessarily a bad thing in any way you look at it, really. Hear me out on this one. If an area suddenly experiences a population boom, it usually ends up leading to a service shortage, which in turn would end up creating jobs in that area and boosting its economy. The other big fallacy is that these places are finite. There are only so many rental properties to go around, and if there's no more room, then no one can go there. So in the end, this big myth about dole bludgers hiding in rural areas is just one big straw man that needs a date with a match. The only reason it exists is to have a finger to point at someone else instead of fixing the problem. The next time you're pointing your finger, look at your hand, because 3 of your fingers are pointing back at you.
The second archive story is about somebody that was stuck on the queue for JobSeeker for so long that they had to start selling their possessions and living on $11 a day.
Let's get into a story from someone whom asked to remain anonymous. I applied for JobSeeker in November. 3 weeks later, I missed a call on a random Thursday afternoon. Shortly after missing that call, I received a text message saying I was going to receive a call later that day and I must answer it. Then shortly after that message, another text message saying my claim had been rejected. A couple of my recontact attempts later, and I was able to clarify which document they were now requesting. I submitted it and I was told that all looks good and my claim was being considered again. But I have received no word since then. It's January and I'm still waiting for a decision with my food supplies running out. I'm going to have to attempt to contact them again, to simply clarify if my claim is actively under consideration, and ask if I should perhaps submit a signed document to initiate a formal review process. I am working as well and have been looking for new opportunities for work. But my income from work has been too low to sustain my basic needs. Ever since the border reopening started spreading COVID wildly here and slowing everything down, I dropped my food budget down to $11 a day, and that works well for me. I sold some personal possessions over Christmas to pay for food and rent. I'm in the black until next week or so, and considering what else I can sell to pay for food and rent during the job seeker claim process. Anyone wanna buy an old iPad? First generation, as demonstrated on stage by Steve Jobs. A collector's piece. This process of claiming job seeker is very frustrating. It's no wonder the phone lines are always overloaded with high call volumes and procedural confusions. It's a badly designed system that functions as a source of debilitating hardship to those in need. This is Centrelink_stories coming in with my opinion. This sounds like a pretty typical experience with how it is with trying to get any kind of information or action from Centrelink in any capacity. It doesn't matter if it's just calling to ask them a simple question about which documents they require for your appointment, or trying to tell them you're going to be late or what have you. On the flip side, if Centrelink wants something from you, then you need to have your phone grafted to the side of your head or your hand, because if you miss their call even once, this can and does happen, as we've just heard. I'm not blaming the Centrelink frontline workers for that by any means. They're just the ones stuck on the phones, and they have a call list longer than an Amazon scam call center, because Centrelink essentially runs on a skeleton crew due to the staff being gutted and replaced with the self-service quote-unquote option, and because a lot of them cop so much abuse that they can't handle it anymore and have to leave. Unfortunately, what that means for the quote-unquote customer is that if your phone is flat, or in another room, or you're driving, or your hands are full with something else, you'd better stop whatever you're doing and make yourself available, or your claim is going to get rejected. They say that they give you 2 to 3 chances to pick up, but sometimes the staff that are calling are under so much pressure that they only let the phone ring a few times and then move on to the next person and mark the person they called as unanswered. Coming back to what this person has said about not hearing anything about their application for roughly 2 months after calling them back and resubmitting the forms, that is not unusual, because I was recently told by Centrelink that my issue similar to this, which is what started this whole endeavor, could take 13 weeks for my appeal to even be looked at. I repeat, 13 weeks to even be looked at. And if the repeal was rejected, then I'd have to reapply, which could take another 13 weeks for them just to look at it. Let that sink in for a moment. If you miss one phone call, that could leave you with nothing for up to 6 months. The homeless population surge over the last few years is starting to make more sense now, right? It's completely ridiculous that the poster has had to sell off their possessions just to stave off homelessness, and being forced to live on $11 a day food-wise is also inexcusable. I know someone is going to say $11 a day isn't so bad. I could do that easily. The next time you're in a supermarket, look at the prices of everything and calculate how much $11 of food is. If that's too hard for you, take $77 into the local supermarket and buy as much as you can and put it aside and live off of that food and nothing else for a week, then come back to me and tell me it's easy. Even after selling their possessions, that's only going to save the poster until the end of the week, and then they're back at square one. So, what are they going to do after that? Take a moment to just think of how you'd be feeling in this situation. As mentioned before, Centrelink is running on a skeleton crew, and I've been told by more than a few that they're often inexperienced contractors. They're trying their best, but most of the senior staff have moved on or been pushed out because they either didn't like where things were going or tried to resist the changes. I don't blame the public-facing staff at Centrelink in the slightest. They're amazing people and doing their best. We owe it to them and ourselves to get our stories out there so that this fundamentally broken system can be seen for what it is and fixed.
Alright, so those archive stories out of the way. Hopefully there won't be any more robot voice. I'm going to try to avoid it. I know that I've mentioned r/Centrelink a few times now. I'm trying to put that behind me. If r/Centrelink or anybody associated with that, and you know who you are and you know what you did, start trying to shut us down again, look, I'm just going to come out, tell the full story, and let you deal with the aftermath. This is your first and only warning. Do not start up again. You lost. We still have the screenshots. We still have the comments that you tried to delete to spin your narrative. Just leave it alone. Alright, moving forward now. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Centrelink Stories. I don't know what the upload schedule for this is going to be. I've got 2 more stories lined up, and then I'm going to be relying on people sending their own stories in to share with everybody else. We'll see how we go from there. Again, do not copy and paste stories from Reddit or Facebook or anywhere else. I don't want them. They have to be your stories in your own words, emailed to the email address. Otherwise, I don't want them. I'm not going to accept them. I'm not going to read them. That's it. Alright, see you next time. To the best of our knowledge, the stories in this podcast are true and accurate. They've been editorialized to prevent copyright abuse. If your story has been shared without your permission, please contact us so that we may blacklist the person that sent that story in. Some details may have been altered to help keep you anonymous. Questions and feedback are welcome to be emailed in at centrelinkcustomerstories@protonmail.com. Should you have any questions, feel free to ask. Remember, if we want to help fix the system, we need to get these stories out there. Share them with us so we can get the stories in front of the people that need to see them. The intro and outro soundtracks sampled for this podcast are The Mess We've Made by Sin Shake Sin and Can't Go to Hell by Sin Shake Sin. Find them on YouTube or Spotify, wherever, and have a great time listening.